Hollywood loves to insert childbirth scenes into its films, portraying this process by its own standards. However, births in American films tend not to be very similar to what actually happens in maternity wards. Remember the panic-stricken women whose waters began to break so suddenly and at the most inopportune moment. Remember the husbands who have no idea how to behave, and end up fainting from experiences in an unexpected sight, right in the delivery room. Such shots can be listed endlessly. And then, from under the delicately placed sheet, they pull out an adorable child with a delightfully cute face, staring at the ceiling or at the cameraman's camera. Drawing on the book This Is Going to Hurt, in which British physician Adam Key details exactly what happens in the delivery room, and with the help of 3 other experts, we dispel 6 birth myths that have been created and perpetuated by Hollywood Dream Factory. Point 1. We are not born face up. During most births, the baby's head emerges first from the vagina. This is what happens in the movies. However, on the screen, the face of the newborn is most often turned up, so that we can see it. In reality, this is not the case. More than 90% of babies before birth are located in the womb with their head down, the so-called head presentation, buttocks up, chin pressed to the chest, and legs and arms bent and pressed to the body. In this case, the baby's face is turned towards the mother's back, and the camera will not be able to see it at the time of birth. This is the most natural position for a baby during childbirth, face down or at least sideways, says Barcelona-based OB/GYN Damien Dexius. The reason for this orientation is simple, so the child takes up less space and feels more free in the womb, he explains. In films, babies are often born face up, with their eyes open and even smiling. Of course, this is very unusual, the doctor adds. Besides, babies are not born as clean as they are portrayed in the movies. I don't know if that's the aesthetic of cinema or it's an anachronism, comments Dr. Dexius. Why an anachronism? The doctor explains that in the past it was customary in hospitals to wash the baby immediately after birth and remove the vernix caseosa, the primordial lubricant, a grayish-white substance with a curdled consistency that covers the skin of the newborn, after which the baby was handed over to the mother, already completely clean. This no longer happens in countries with developed medicine, the obstetrician explains, because studies have shown that it is good for the health of the baby that the original lubricant remains on his skin for several hours after birth. 2. How amniotic fluid actually drains. The amniotic fluid that forms around the embryo is filled with amniotic fluid, often referred to as amniotic fluid. In films, we often see scenes of a sudden departure of these waters, after which the pregnant woman almost immediately begins childbirth. An example from the TV show Sex and the City. Charlotte's water breaks when she gets into an argument outside a restaurant. Then he runs to catch a taxi. There is nothing unusual about this. After the waters have begun to break, you really have to rush to the doctor for an examination to confirm whether the fetal bladder has really broken, because the woman understands that she is losing fluid, but does not see what it is, says Dr. Dexius. An examination is necessary because it is not always so easy to determine whether it is amniotic fluid or urine, especially if it is a few drops or a little moisture. Medical myths about childbirth. About the exact date, spicy food and waste of water. Age is 1 day, the first hours of a new life. However, a rupture of the membranes usually does not mean that labor is about to begin or has already begun, as often happens in films. In fact, this is only part of the processes taking place in the body of the expectant mother. It's much more common for a woman to realize after a few contractions that she's in the process of having a baby. It's part of the natural course of events during childbirth, says Anne Yates of the International Confederation of Midwives, ICM, who has delivered for more than 40 years in various regions of the world. In fact, if the fetal bladder burst long before delivery, long before the baby is ready to be born, this could mean a complication, she adds. Point 3. Posture in which they give birth. Another common scene in movies is a woman in labor sitting on a high birthing table. There are plenty of examples too, from the character of Katherine Heigl in Knocked Up to the character of Jennifer Aniston in Friends. Indeed, this is a convenient position for childbirth, but not the most common in the world. In the UK and the US, it's customary for the woman to be semi-sitting with her feet on the birthing table, with her legs elevated, says Dr. Dexius. But in countries like Spain, for example, the most common birthing position is lying down, with the knees supported, but the legs are not raised like that. This position is the most common in Brazil, and this is how gynecologists examine women. There are a few other positions that women give birth in that are rarely seen in movies or on TV. standing, squatting, sitting on a bench, or lying on their side. In addition, the position depends on the stage of childbirth in which the woman is. She can change position during childbirth in order to speed up the birth of the child. Yates believes that Hollywood's portrayal of childbirth poses problems in real life. For women, it can be difficult to give birth in one position or another, and the cinema imposes on them the idea of U200B, U200BO it supposedly should be. Thor. Where did the postpartum period go? The postpartum period is usually referred to as the first 6 weeks after the birth of a baby. The postpartum period is the most important thing that is forgotten in the movies, says Dr. Dexius. Much of what happens after childbirth is rarely shown in Hollywood films. Postpartum psychosis. I was always afraid to go crazy, but it happened after the birth of my son. Naturally, you won't see the separation of the placenta or the suturing of tears that happen during labor. But not only that. Postpartum depression is shown very superficially in movies. The gynecologist says of the condition experienced by at least 1 in every 10 women who have given birth, according to WHO statistics. Movies generally don't mention how difficult it can be to start breastfeeding, how having a baby can affect bladder and bowel health, and dozens of other body changes that can be very challenging for a woman. These films don't show how difficult physical recovery after a caesarean section can be, adds Dr. Dexius. All these movie images that push us to think that childbirth is something simple are actually very dangerous, because it just doesn't always happen, says the doctor. 5. Heart-rending screams of pain. And here is another classic situation for the birth scenes invented by filmmakers. The woman in labor screams in pain. In the past, mothers in labor weren't given anesthetics, explains Cuban doctor Josephine Lopez. Why is it much harder for women to give birth than their distant ancestors? Yes, it's true that contractions are painful, and when they last a long time, a woman is exhausted. However, these pains do not necessarily make a woman scream. Although, of course, everyone has their own pain threshold, says Lopez. If epidural anesthesia is used, then this usually does not happen. Yates believes that films often depict a woman in childbirth as weak. Women are strong. It's kind of a common trait, the midwife emphasizes. And often they go through labor, which is no doubt painful, without a single scream. Yes, sometimes they moan, but almost never you will hear such heart-rending screams as in the movies, adds Yates. 6. Helpless, confused fathers. The image of a clumsy and fearful husband giving birth is another cinematic cliché. Example. Hugh Grant's character in the comedy melodrama 9 Months, who does exactly what a man shouldn't do when his wife is in labor. Dad's Day, or Who and What Needs to Know About Childbirth. We're shown terrified men, pale as death when labor begins. Some even faint, says Dr. Dexius. Can't be called normal. As Yates says, in Hollywood films, a man is often portrayed as a nuisance or as a person who does not understand how to behave during childbirth. In fact, many of those who accompany the woman in labor are in perfect harmony with her, the midwife emphasizes.